Doug, thank you very much, first of all, for being here. And virtually we'll have also João Paulo Almeida, who's the Director General for the Portuguese Olympic Committee. So Jurissa and João Paulo will join us virtually for this panel. Thank you both for joining us also. So Doug, first of all, I would like to ask you for your first remarks and telling us what are the main challenges nowadays for protecting the youth.
Well, it's great to be here. I'm from New York, as you introduced. I'm the Vice President of Legal Affairs for Major League Soccer. I apologize to those of you in the audience who cringe when you hear the word soccer, but I'll continue to use it. As way of background, for those of you who don't know much about us, Major League Soccer has evolved quite a bit in the last few years. 5 years ago, we were a league of 20 clubs. Today, we are 28 clubs going to 29 clubs next year. This is our third year of operating what we call MLS Next, which is our amateur arm, where we have over 130 clubs, nearly 600 teams competing at the highest levels of amateur competition in the United States, and 90% of our youth national team pool comes from MLS Next. So we are really completing the player pathway in the United States as soccer progresses, and we have many great leagues, including the NWSL on the women's side. For us, the youth space is relatively new in that regard, insofar as that we are operating an amateur platform, and there could be no greater area of need than minor protection, as unfortunately our country has learned the hard way when it comes to some very high-profile incidents in the Olympic movement.
And what are the main obstacles you are dealing with?
Well, there's a great deal of challenge when you're operating a pathway by which minors are traveling from amateur ranks to professional ranks, including the integration of minors into a professional sports setting. When I think about the team sport in America, we may be the only team sport that operates with minors on professional contracts. And so you want to make sure that minors have the opportunity to integrate, to learn, to develop, while still providing protections that keep them safe, because they are, by nature, a vulnerable population. The U.S. Center for Safe Sport has proven to be an incredibly good model for us in that regard, from everything from ensuring training that those who interact with minors on a regular basis understand the regulations that apply to them, as well as minor protection policies, which I always say boil down to very simply make sure that your interactions with minors are observable and interruptible. You want to avoid those one-on-one settings in private where, unfortunately, things can go wrong.
We were talking about the universal standards on youth and protection and child protection, and there are 4 pillars. There is recruitment, training, education, and protection of children. Which one of these 4 would you focus?
For us, given our where we stand in the universe, I think it's the protections. Once those children are under our stewardship, playing for our clubs, it becomes critically important that we are both supporting and protecting them.
Can you give us examples of what's happening, your work on the field now?
Well, I think one of the areas that I hear a lot from clubs is understanding locker room settings, for instance. The privacy that you want to provide minors in the locker room for changing and showering while still providing them the opportunity to be with the rest of the club. Traveling to the extent that players are not given their own rooms, making sure that roommates are appropriately close in age. Hazing and bullying and issues of that sort have a long history in sports and have been rooted out continuously. And that's a real area of focus in the United States and something that we care a lot about.
And what we saw a few minutes ago in this stage, what's the importance of the creation of these universal standards?
I think in many regards, this is an area the world lags behind. And I think, unfortunately, it took some very high-profile incidents in the United States to capture our country's attention. And I think it's important that the world pays attention to these same issues. I think having standards to look to, whether because you're adopting or you're modeling after, are critically important. As I said, in compliments to my own country and my fellow panelists, the U.S. Center for Safe Sport has given us in America real leadership in this area, not only for investigations that go beyond where we lose the scope and it turns over to their jurisprudence, but also in the development of model policies that are both practical and pragmatic and serve to serve our youth.
So, Juris, thank you once again for joining us. I think you are hearing us. And I would like to address you and ask you for a scenario of what's happening in the United States and about the importance of these universal standards that we were talking about.
Okay, that was the best public service announcement about the Center for Safe Sport that I've heard in a long time. You know, it's interesting because what we've been able to do in the States, as Doug mentioned, really happened as a result of really high profile cases and just some really terrible things that happened to many gymnasts. And you know, the United States at that time was struggling to figure out how to prevent this from ever happening again. And so the United States Congress took action and authorized the U.S. Center for Safe Sport in 2018 to really take a keen focus and look at the Olympic and Paralympic movement on how we could improve. And that not only meant around educational standards, but prevention policies, but also how we were holding those who are involved in sport accountable. And so we were charged to do that by investigating allegations of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse and misconduct, and then appropriately sanctioning those who should not be part of the Olympic movement, and certainly not involved with minors. And so what we've seen over the last 5 years is that there's certainly been an evolution where we're just learning more. The center is growing and really able to take on more and support the 55 plus national governing bodies that exist within the Olympic and Paralympic movement in the United States, but also that we are starting to get noticed by countries across the globe to model after what we have done in whole or in part, how we are impacting athletes, not only for safety in sport, but really systemic culture change across sporting in general. And this is incredibly important because, you know, not only do our athletes in the States travel from city to city, from state to state, but they're also traveling abroad where they are interacting with athletes, coaches, medical professionals from all over the world. And you know what we have seen because of that is that there is a lack of consistency across what the expectations are for athletes and how they are to be kept safe, whether they're minors or they're adults. And so one of the things that really drew me to the universal standards was, you know, that possibility of creating a consistent environment for athletes to thrive. We even see it here in the United States where, yes, the Olympic movement is required to do certain things to be able to keep athletes safe, but that is only a small portion of our sporting community. And so really trying to develop consistent policies and practices that every athlete, every parent, every coach can learn to expect is something that we're working towards. And I think that with the advent of the universal standards, we're starting to see this movement globally as well. And that is a great day for sport. That's a great day for culture change. And it's certainly a great day for athletes and how we are really respecting and treating them and making sure that they're safe. And, you know, these standards, I think, go a long way in doing that. And I'm really eager and excited to see all the organizations and countries and NGOs take part in this, because I think this is a real first step in ensuring that we do that.
We are talking a lot about the USA, so I would ask you to do a comparison between the United States and a more global scenario. Can you do that?
Sure. So, you know, what we've learned over the last several years is that there are many countries that are establishing safe sporting entities. Some of them are combined, where you'll have investigations and policy development and education all in one. Others are placed all around the country in different pockets. And what we've learned from them and they from us is that there is a lot of overlap and a lot of learnings to be had around how we're approaching all of this. One of the things that I've seen, and I've seen this played out not only in Europe but in Canada and Australia, where we've got lots of entities that are springing up to really focus very intently and are funded to do so, to make sure that as athletes are entering into particularly the Olympic space, that there are certain expectations not only of them but of their coaches. And so some really interesting things are coming out, not only with how countries are starting to stand up these organizations, but also how they are being received by athletes and others in their countries. Because particularly, in the United States, it was long overdue, and I think every other country could probably agree that it's all overdue for their country as well. And so being able to learn from each other, where we've had pitfalls and mistakes and learnings and winnings, and sharing those with countries as they are developing their own policies and stance towards safe sporting and safeguarding has been incredibly important. A week does not go by where we don't get a phone call or an email from a country who is looking to learn from that. So I think that there is a global movement that is happening, and that's largely in part because athletes are demanding it. And it is time, long overdue, for us to be listening to them and what their needs are.
I believe João Paulo Almeida joins us also virtually, and so I would address him now and ask for the scenario, maybe here in Portugal, and your first remarks on these matters.
Well, first of all, thank you. I hope that you all can see me and hear me in good conditions, because I'm in the middle of a business travel, and the setting is not the proper thing to speak with you, but I managed to find a place. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I think we are constantly raising this issue up in the political agenda here in Portugal and in Europe as well, where lots of high-profile cases are rising. But to be honest with you, not only here in Portugal, but I can speak for the European Olympic movement. We are, when comparing to Canada and the United States and North America, we are only giving baby steps on this regard. Why is that? First of all, because we don't have safe sport entities with enough investigative powers to tackle this threat. Second, we don't have here a comprehensive capacity building program to implement standards on child protection, safeguarding, and on general well-being of athletes, precisely to start to move this systemic culture that Julius has pointed out. And so, on this regard, we have a lot to learn with the North Americans, especially because they have the tools to tackle this issue. Of course, it is quite important and quite relevant to set in motion and to implement standards like those that SIGA has. But we cannot mark our own exams. This has to be enforced by third parties and independent organizations in order to provide a clear roadmap on the flaws that we have to tackle. Because if not, we will not be able to change the scenario, and we will persist in put all the athletes in a vulnerable position. So it is very important to empower organizations with capacity to tackle this issue, which is not the case of the Olympic movement here in Portugal, because we don't have jurisdiction over our federations and national members. We have started to implement a comprehensive program in the area of integrity. First, 5 years ago, covering the issues related to anti-corruption and match fixing, but we are only now delivering content in the area of safeguarding. But we will do this in kind of soft law and recommendation approach. And we need to do much more than this if we want to really tackle this issue, if we want to really empower the athletes as the United States has done, as Julie said, with the Congress bill approved, that in the last resort, you are able to decertify national federation from the Olympic movement if they don't implement standards and they don't have in place concrete regulation and codes of conduct on this regard.
So who should we be talking to, João Paulo, to get the job done? Do we need some high-profile cases like we were talking about in the USA?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the sad reality, as we have seen very recently in the UK, the gymnastics, where the UK sport asked the Commission a study to apparently NY to review the policies of safeguarding and child protection in the UK gymnastics. Unfortunately, we only react when some cases erupt. And we need to change this mindset. And on that regard, some measures can be implemented. First and foremost, education training. We need to have mandatory contents to the coaches from grassroots to elite level on these matters. Okay, and this is not an insurmountable thing to set in motion. Second, we need to condition the public funding to the implementation and the enforcement and the assessment of these standards and of these measures. While we don't implement this, we can be year after year only talk shopping and saying that we are facing huge vulnerabilities and that success and performance persists to be over the health and well-being of the athletes. If we don't want to react to these high-profile cases, we need to implement measures. And to implement measures, we need to do this. Condition public funding to organizations who don't enforce this kind of standards and provide third-party independent assessment to safeguarding child protection standards.
To build on what he said, it's very notable that Major League Soccer itself is not governed by the U.S. Center for Safe Sport. Some of our athletes, some of our coaches are based on their licensures or memberships on national teams. But private actors who take this issue seriously can build on the good work of places like the U.S. Center for Safe Sport. So while U.S. Center for Safe Sport will do its own investigations in certain matters that fall into mandatory or discretionary categories, where they do not assume jurisdiction for one reason or the other, we will then do the investigation ourselves. We require our clubs to maintain minor protection policies that are built off of and largely modeled on the good work that U.S. Center for Safe Sport has done. So I critically agree that education is the first step, because while it is wonderful to have an entity like the U.S. Center for Safe Sport leading the way, it falls on the rest of us in the industry to play our parts and independently educate those working for us or for our affiliated entities and clubs to understand their responsibilities and how to safeguard.
Juris, I don't know if you have any remarks on this.
Yes, absolutely. I could not agree more. One of the things and the gaps that we have here in the United States is that our jurisdiction extends only to those impacted and involved with the Olympic and Paralympic movement, which is roughly about 14 million people. And so it does not capture colleges and universities. It does not capture local parks and rec or major league teams. And so, one of the things that we have really been trying to focus on is how do we share those learnings, share the policies that we've developed, share the training, and offer that to those, because the things that we have learned while working within the Olympic movement are certainly applicable to those who are outside of it or maybe on the periphery. And the more people, the more organizations, the more sporting clubs that we are able to work with, we will start to see that consistency build up on its own. Because the Olympic movement was required to do this. The Center for State Sport was developed and set up because there was an imminent need. But there are lots of organizations across this world who do not have that same requirement. And so we do have to get people to want to do this, to be able to want to impact culture change in this way. It certainly includes education. It certainly includes acknowledgement that abuse exists, but also willing to put the power and the dollars behind it to make it happen. We were certainly lucky in that there was legislation that was passed that supported the funding of the organization, but many countries do not have that luxury. And are really struggling to figure out how to stand up organizations, how to pay for it, and how to have that power and influence in their countries to be able to make some of these things happen. So I think that that's spot on from both Doug and Jean-Paul.
Okay, going a little further away from this matter, I find there's a topic very interesting about the youth. That is how to throw the barrier between the pressure to win, and we know there is that's very present in the United States, and the values of sport. How do we do that?
Well, it is a very difficult line, particularly when you transition to the professional, where wins and losses go to the bottom line for a club. It starts, I think, in the amateur ranks. In the U.S., good sportsmanship, avoiding behaviors that are overly aggressive by coaches and other leaders that transition into emotional abuse, physical and violent abuse of different types that are regulated in the United States now by the U.S. Center for Safe Sport, are important because we want to develop them not only as athletes, but as people. And a lot of what we learn in sport are the ethics of hard work, effort, and giving our best regardless of the result. There's a mental aspect to this as well, and mental health should not be lost in all of this. We're talking about minors here. This applies equally to adults. But minors have their own needs emotionally. They're going through development in a way that may be different than you or myself are. And so we cannot lose sight of the fact that they are still developing young people who are striving to be excellent professionals, but have different needs than, say, some of their adult contemporaries.
Juris? We are seeing you.
Sorry about that. I would agree. When you think about the needs of minor athletes and this desire to win and hopefully go professional one day, that is certainly something that not only drives the kids themselves, but it also drives their parents and everyone around them. And what we have seen is that when you have that innate desire to just win at everything, sometimes you start to lose sight of what's important, and you also start to overlook things that could be potentially dangerous or put youth in dangerous situations because you just want to win. And so I think part of our work in working with governing bodies and local organizations across the country is to really start to shift priorities, right? We certainly want winners. We want kids to excel. We want sport to be a huge part of their lives, but we also want them to do it safely. And I think sometimes because of that, you have to recognize that you won't always win. And nobody wants to hear that, right? Nobody wants to be second place. Everybody wants to be number one. But in order to do that, I think that you have to really set expectations and boundaries. And sometimes that means the athletes setting them themselves, taking a step back to take care of their own selves, right? Whether that is mental health or otherwise. But also I think it impacts parents and their decisions on maybe not sending them to certain camps or having them coach with certain people that that may be questionable. And so I think that it really takes the entire community around the athlete to really take a very close look at what winning costs, and to make sure that the priorities that they are setting for their athletes to ultimately get these kids to be at the top of their game sometimes have to be shifted.
João Paulo, is it different in Portugal or is the same obstacle here?
Well, the only difference here is when we are talking about grassroots sports that Doug has mentioned, we rely in a large voluntary base with people who most part are retired people with a different mindset to what sport means. And it is harder to shift the mindset if we don't have some people with a different culture, with a different approach to this issue. Because because work ethics and sport ethics and hard work doesn't mean that winning at all costs, that we will undermine and jeopardize the mental well-being and safety of an athlete. And this is very difficult to break beyond the generations. Most notably, and we have this issue here in Portugal, but the United States suffered the same problem in some sports, with coaches coming from other cultures, notably Eastern Europe. It's very difficult to change this mindset. And on that regard, it is quite important, as Julie mentioned, to engage other stakeholders, most notably child protection agencies, parents, and other organizations, because unfortunately, sport organizations here in Europe are very insular organizations. They live in silos. And to tackle this issue, to raise the awareness to the impact in the long term and in the adulthood of these athletes, you need to engage other stakeholders with a different view about these problems. This is what some organizations are trying to do in Europe, most notably the Council of Europe with the Start to Talk program, in order to change the mindset of this voluntary basis of old people that are in the grassroots sports in Europe, where they are not enough flexible to change this view.
Before I open the discussion over to your questions, if you have them, João Paulo, I would like to ask you if are there new abuses perhaps that we are facing and the youth, the young athletes are facing nowadays different from previous years?
Yeah, nowadays with the so-called digital environment, new approaches to, let's say, to the same kind of abuses. And somehow, not only in this issue of child protection and mental well-being, but other areas like the manipulation of sports competitions, kids are quite to approaches from digital environment. And it is important somehow to increase the capacity of coaches to not only to be aware of this issue, but only to be able to support their athletes to address this issue and even work hand in hand with the parents. That's because sometimes we tend to look to coaches that as somehow with excelling your performance. And in grassroots sports, a coach is way more than that. Is someone, let's say, pivotal for your education to prepare you for the adulthood through sport. Is way more than a professional or someone who is there to provide you with skills to enhance your performance. And this is where we need to change it. We need to move this content to the core of the education of coaches here in Portugal. Because while we are persisting to live on denial to this, how can we have coaches really equipped to tackle this problem when this is not an issue in their education? This is not mandatory content on their capacity building.
Okay, so we'll move on to your questions, if you have them, please. Anyone? Okay. Thank you, sir. I don't know if you can hear you. We can't hear you, so I'm sorry. Can you?
Tá, já deu, ok.
Okay.
It's a question for Doug. The lack of youth academies in some MLS clubs could it turn more difficult to MLS to control potential abuses in youth?
I'm not sure I heard it fully. Was the question, are certain of our clubs more difficult than others to control?
Yes, clubs that have youth academies and clubs that don't have it.
All right, so all of our clubs have academies now, but they differ quite dramatically from a youth protection perspective in terms of how they're structured. So when thinking about how clubs operate here in Europe with residential academies and boys traveling quite distances to be part of these programs at very young ages, that is still relatively uncommon in the United States. But we have a few clubs that do have dormitories, homestays, and the like. Those are regulated by our states. And not so surprisingly, those clubs tend to have more issues that boil up when you have youth, 24/7 in your midst. So I would say that with the advantages of some of these residential programs, there also become unique challenges as youth are in private spaces with each other at relatively young ages, away from their parents or guardians. I'd also say our clubs are all at very different levels, to this day, on getting on top of these issues. This is something, as you've heard, that is still relatively new in America as an issue of focus. And while all of our clubs have or are working towards strong policies in this area, policy is not enough. Practice, education, and culture matter too. And that starts with the staff who are working daily with these young developing soccer players. It runs down to the players themselves and the cultures on teams. We heard about social media and the internet, an incredibly challenging area in today's world because, as we all know, the youth are far more savvy in that world than most of us, but with disappearing messages and other potential sources that can cause them issues or from outsiders. These are danger zones that they need to be educated on, proper use of, and we, overseeing them, need to use proper, again, open and observable means of communication with the youth.
Thank you. Anyone else? No, so I'll leave the next few minutes for the final remarks from our panelists, starting with you, João Paulo. Any final remarks?
What Doug has just mentioned popped up to me what is quite important that some national federations are doing, not only recently, not only in the States, but in Europe, which is the certification process. It is quite important to set this area of the safeguarding and child protection as a core part of all youth development programs of a club, and to be proper assessed by the national governing bodies as a way to have an academy certified or a club certified to be able to tackle these problems. This can be a very important strategy and a very important tool in the hands of the sport organization, in the hands of the sport governing bodies, to give a sign that they are properly addressing these issues. And this can be a way to be paid in order to have strong and robust tools to tackle this issue. Of course, it's not enough because, as we all know, culture eats strategy at the breakfast, meaning that we can have the best programs and the strategic actions in the paper, but then when we will turn it into action, we will face years and years and years of barriers to overcome. We need to really fast start moving from talk to action.
Thank you very much, Juris, for any final ideas.
I would say that I think it's important for us to continue to recognize that changing policy and practice and culture is going to take time. But there's been a lot of movement across the globe when it comes to approaches to making sure that that happens. And I really appreciate being part of this panel just to hear some of that, but also encourage everyone who's in the audience to reach out to all of us, to really start to learn what we have been able to do and what we're able to share as you are starting to stand up your own organizations and agencies around this, and really taking a close look at either implementing the SIGA standards or developing other policies and practices across your country that focuses on athlete safety and safeguarding. I think that we've all learned a little bit of different things along the way, and if we can be helpful to be able to support others' countries' journeys in this, please know that the Center for Safe Sport is certainly ready and willing to do that, because the moment that we all start to embrace the consistency of how we impact our athletes and ensure that safeguarding is our top priority is the moment that our athletes will be safe.
Thank you, Doug.
Resources differ dramatically, organization to organization, country to country. Things like background checks, how you develop your physical plan, those may greatly differ, but we all have equal access to the ability to educate, to try to work on cultural change, to interact in safe environments with minors. So there are things that all organizations and people associated with sport can do to change the culture and operate in a safer environment. And I think that's the starting ground for everyone.
Thank you, the three of you, for this so interesting discussion about the development of the youth and the athletes at young age. And this is it for the second day of our Integrity Week in Sports.